This is the Trading Psychology Podcast. This is VP, creator of No Nonsense Forex and author of the book No Nonsense Forex Trading Psychology. And with me, as he is every week, it is the forever festive Robb Reinhold.
Your introductions are getting more and more interesting. Forever festive. I have never in my entire life been called festive before. And actually, I just got yelled at because when I went to the post office to get stamps for our Christmas cards, I got regular stamps, not holiday stamps. I got regular stamps. I didn't even think about getting holiday stamps. So festive, thank you for calling me festive, but I'm anything but.
And if you're wondering, we do pre-record these. And so this one we're actually going to release on Christmas Day because Christmas Day falls on a Monday this year, if I recall correctly. And what we wanted to do is to not have such a heavy episode on Christmas, because who really wants that? So what we're going to do is a little something different. This was, I think, Robb's idea initially, and then I kind of expanded on it. What we're going to do is we are going to make an episode called What Advice We Would Give to Our Younger Self. Now, younger could mean anything, right? So, Robb and I are both in our 40s. And so what we decided to do is do this in 3 parts. First of all, we're going to give advice to our 18-year-old self. And then we're going to give advice to ourselves at the age where we began trading. So for Robb, that was his early 20s. For me, that was my early 30s. And then what type of advice we would give to our 40-year-old selves. And so hopefully everybody here falls into one of those categories or has experienced being one of those ages, at least, if not all 3. And we'll just kind of riff from there, Robb. Yeah, we don't even have an outline for this. We're just going to go off the top of the head. What do you think, Robb?
When you started talking about this, I was like, oh, this is like Charles Dickens. This is past, present, future. But no, it's not. It's just distant past, more distant past, and the more recent past. So we're just stuck in Christmas past here.
Yeah, but that's okay because I look fondly back on those times, even when sometimes those times weren't always great, because it's just so funny where my headspace was at the time and the way I thought. And I could have really used somebody to come in and give me this type of advice. I just didn't have anybody like that. My dad was great, but he was very different from me, and I didn't have any older siblings, and I just didn't have any influences like that. So I wonder how I would have reacted to advice like this. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. We'll start with you on the first one, Robb. What advice? And remember, you can only give one piece, so you can't go more than one. What piece of advice would you give to your 18-year-old self? You just graduated high school. You went to the graduation ceremony. You're all full of life, getting ready for college. What would you tell your 18-year-old self and why?
I actually brought this up in a couple episodes where I said that how stubborn I was. I've actually said on this podcast that if I had the ability to go back in time and tell myself advice, I would have given myself the bird. So, look, I'm going to tell you the advice I would want to give my 18-year-old self, but I'm not going to think about this too hard because I already know my 18-year-old self wouldn't have taken this advice. So, my advice to my 18-year-old self is life is long. Life is very long. You don't need to sprint at 18 years old. And in fact, me sprinting so hard, I was so ambitious, set me back. That if I just had the understanding that this was a marathon, not a 50-yard dash, that I would have done much, much better in my 20s. So my advice to my 18-year-old self would be, life is long, chill out, just keep working, and you'll get where you want to go.
Interesting. It's funny, too, because, I don't think I would have taken that advice either. I mean, I would have to know for sure that this was VP from the future giving me advice, because I was kind of like you. I always thought I was the smartest person in the room. I was very stubborn. So who is anybody to give me advice at the ripe old age of 18, where I am experienced because I've seen 18 trips around the globe, and I officially know everything. I'm sure you were probably like that, too.
Yeah, and it's kind of silly because you don't really become self-aware until like 13, 14. So you've only really had 4 years of real experience at 18. So it's silly, but same way.
Yeah. So for me, and this is going to be really controversial, but you have to understand, I'm giving this advice to me, not to somebody who feels differently than I do. But, and I even have to preface this because everybody is a product of their environment, right? And where I grew up in the Midwest, and Rob, I'm sure this applies to Utah probably. Assuming, did you grow up in Utah?
I did grow up in Utah, and I spent some time in Texas as well.
Okay, just making sure. So, what I would have said to myself, because my heart was here, but my head wasn't just because of my environment, and my advice to my younger self would actually be advice that I ended up taking. And that is to not get married until much later in life. Now, I'm not married now, but I remember when I was 22, I financed my first car. And I even made sure it had ample space in the back seat because, well, I figure, hey, in about 3 or 4 years, I'll probably have some kids back there. And it wasn't even because that's what I really wanted to do. My dream was never to start a family. It was always to travel the world without the burden of time or money, which is a really lofty goal if you think about it. But that's what it was. And I didn't want to just have a small sample size of women to choose from in my hometown. I wanted to go global. I wanted to experience different cultures, different flavors, different styles, different everything. And if I didn't do that, I mean, I made it so much later in life. It took me so long to achieve that goal. But if I didn't do this first, then I know for a fact that I would have harbored some type of unfair, very unfair resentment towards my future wife and my future kids. And that is not healthy. And if I am not in the right headspace, then my entire relationship with my newly chosen family is not going to be there either. And who knows how that could have ended up. And that's how more than half relationships in our country even end up in the first place, Rob. And I wonder how much of that is because men are such go-getters and such doers that there's so many of us that would really like to have accomplished a lot more before we settled down and it became a lot harder. And I'm so glad I ended up doing that, but that's not what I was thinking my life was going to be when I was 18. So I would have made sure that I got into that headspace by giving myself that type of advice. I'm curious to see what you think about that, being somebody who did get married early and is such a great family man, but understanding that all this advice is unique to who we are.
Yeah, what you just said hit it right on the head. It's unique. I love that you were self-aware enough to know this about yourself because you're right. You would have ended up in resentment, and resentment is ugly. It's ugly, living in regret. So I love that you knew that about yourself at a young enough age to where you were able to actually take action on it. Love it.
Yeah, because what ends up happening, and I don't want to go too deep into this, is we end up living somebody else's dream because we're in love and we love them and we want to make them happy. But we neglect ourselves, and sometimes it's okay to be selfish and stubborn for the greater good. And I always thought that was the case for me. So let's move on to the next sub-question, I guess. If we were to give advice to ourselves when we first began trading, keep in mind, Rob, how old were you when you started, or right abouts, early 20s? Is that correct?
21. 20 was when I started dabbling in trading, and I'd say 22 is when I use the term went pro. I don't even know what that means, but it was the year that I'm like, no, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. I didn't get there at 22, but that's when I made the decision.
Okay, and for me, it was certainly early 30s. I don't remember the exact day, but when I was like, okay, burn the boats, we're going forward, this is it, and I'm not looking back. So start us off here. What advice would you give 21 or 22-year-old Robb Reinhold right when he was full of all this energy and piss and vinegar and ready to take on the world and become super rich in his early 20s and live the great life? What would you tell that man?
Well, I would tell that kid, hey, look, I was just here 4 years ago, you idiot. I told you to chill the F out. You're not chill. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So again, I would literally tell myself at 22, and look, there's not a lot of change between 18 and 22, but I would tell myself the same thing. Look, you got the fire, you got the passion, you got all the ingredients. necessary to make this recipe. The recipe takes time. That's the only thing you don't have, and there's no way you can change that. Time is part of the recipe, and you just have to go through the time process. I didn't fully understand the time process of becoming really good at something and really successful at something. I did not understand that at that age, and I would try to get myself to understand that time, aka experience, is part of the recipe to success.
And it's funny, I would give myself the exact same advice. Our perceptions are really strange. Our frame of reference is just so thrown off because at 22, like we think 28 and 29 is old. And at 32, you think 40 is old. I'm in my mid 40s now, and it's weird. Like I have more energy when I wake up in the morning than I ever had, that I can ever remember having. Maybe I had more when I was a little kid. I don't know. But it's weird. Like I don't feel old, and it doesn't have to be that way if you take care of yourself. So I would say, look, man, I know you want to get out of restaurants. I know you fear getting older and only being good at one thing, which is waiting tables, which is not a very sustainable career. I know there's some fear there, and I know you want to get out of this industry as soon as you can. But the only options for you to get out of something quickly is something that is highly, highly risky or something that is highly illegal. And you don't want to do either of those two things. If you're going to embark on this journey, you better understand it is going to take time. But don't be afraid of that time, because age is only something that gets you if you allow it. And you would be surprised about how getting up in age can actually be a good thing instead of a bad thing, as long as you make good decisions along the way. So maybe that would be another piece of advice I would give, but we're only allowed one. So that would be exactly my advice too.
Well, I think that is, again, awesome advice. The question is, would you have taken it at that age? I bet at that age you would have taken it.
It would have been hard, man, because I remember at the time I was at a restaurant that did a lot of advertising with the convention center, and then all of a sudden they had the bright idea to stop, and things went from good to really not so good, and it was tough. And you're just like, man, I had such great expectations. Things were going so well, and now it's not. And I'm getting older. I shouldn't be scraping by. That's kind of the time where you see your friends and your peers kind of turn that corner and start getting promoted and start making more money. And so they're buying things now, and you're actually going the other way. That's tough, man. You would do a lot to reverse that, especially if you're somebody who feels like they are destined for bigger things. So it would have been a hard sell. I'll say that. I can't really say if I would have said yes or no, but it certainly wouldn't have been a slam dunk yes.
One of the great things about getting older is you can actually look back and make these determinations of what it really meant. And you looking at that situation, where you are now after all these years, that was a really big turning point. And you theoretically shouldn't change that, because that is part of the whole experience that led you to where you are today, which is a really good place. So I look back on all of my quote unquote bad moments and down moments. I cherish them, because those are the moments where I made changes. Those are the moments that I grew and I got better, and it led me to my next success. So it's just so cool when you get older. And I remember as a kid hearing old people saying, oh, I'd never go back to being 18. Oh my gosh, I loved 18. 18 was so cool. It was so great. And I would hear old people say this, and I'd be like, ugh, I'm never going to say that when I get older. Now that I'm in my late 40s, I would never go back to being 18. I would never go back, because it's just the understanding that you get as you get older. I hate it. I hate it to admit that, like, when my parents said it was just a phase, I looked back and it was just a phase. I hate that so much. And so when I was raising my kids, I made sure to never say that to them, because I just remember how it made me feel. But it's right. It was just a phase.
So family aside, it's hard to imagine this, but let's just say, the wife and kids and the family you've created now never existed. You wouldn't want to go back to being 18 with the knowledge you have now and how unstoppable you would be at that age in this modern time?
I've actually thought about this question a lot. The answer is you would conquer the world. You would literally conquer the world. But you would also have to hang out with 18-year-olds, how you are right now. Are you okay with that? Because if you didn't, you would be lonely. You would be alone and lonely, and it really wouldn't be until you were maybe 27, 28 to where you could even find some companionship, unless you were the 18-year-old that hung out with 40-year-olds. So I've actually thought about it. The social part of life would be very difficult. Imagine that first date and that first kiss. You'd be like, this is probably not going to work out. It would not be a good way to be 18 with all this knowledge.
You are right. I would have to hang out with 18-year-olds. And back then it was really just all about how much beer you could drink. And that was literally it. So I don't think I would have any tolerance for that at all. So that's a really good point.
You'd be a hermit. You'd live alone. You'd be lonely.
Or I would be that weird 18-year-old that hung out with 40-year-olds and did nothing else. The 40-year-olds who probably didn't want to hang out with an 18-year-old. But yeah, no, you're right. There's not much of a choice there. So yeah, I think you've convinced me on that. Let's go ahead then. And since we're going backwards, let's go forwards and talk about our 40-year-old self. Now that we've had some time away from that and we've gotten older, Robb, what advice would you give to yourself at age 40? Now, at age 40, you've already done a lot. You've established a really great, successful business, and everything's going amazing. What type of advice would you even be able to give to somebody like that?
Let me start out with some good news for everyone who's young and they look and say, oh, 40, ugh, gross. That's what I used to say. When someone's like, I'm 40, I'd be like, ugh, gross. I loved turning 40. 40 was such a great period of time. You had got to a point where you were very comfortable with yourself. You've had all these failures, you've had successes, and you finally got to a point, again, this was for me in my 40s. I know this happens differently with everyone, but I finally gotten to a point where like I'd put in the work, I had gotten the reward for it, and I was in a good place, and I loved 40. But remember, this is, what advice would I give myself when I was 40? I'm almost a decade past that point. I think this is going to surprise you. We didn't talk about this before this episode, Patrick, but I actually think this is going to surprise you. I would tell my 40-year-old self, make more friends, make more hobbies. Don't lose too much of yourself to quote unquote business/capitalism. Now look, I was just a diehard capitalist, just so ambitious in my 20s and 30s. And I now look and see my friends who developed deep relationships with their friends, and they got into golf and they did all this stuff. And I was just work. I was just all about work, all about work, all about work. My advice to my 40-year-old self would be to have a more diverse life and have a lot more hobbies than you do today. Does that surprise you at all?
I can't say if it surprises me or not, but I think that's tremendous advice. And that's advice I could probably give myself right now. Because you have to understand, Robb, most people had not accomplished that much at 40. A lot of people are going to get to that age and feel like they could have accomplished a lot more. So that kind of ties in with my advice to myself. But regarding yours, I think it's great because where I'm at right now, I am a capitalist on steroids. Like the financial world and starting new things and building and kind of nurturing those things is what really motivates me every single day. I absolutely love what I'm doing. I couldn't think of doing anything else. But I've lost some things along the way. And I think one of those things is something you and I talked about a long time ago, is I was a big outdoorsman, coming from the Midwest. It's one of the things I really love to do. And then I moved to Vegas, and it was just one of those things where none of my friends wanted to do that. None of the girls I dated really wanted to do any of that. And I had a kayak that I used a lot, but I had to sell it to make my mortgage one time. And so there goes that. And then it just kind of left me along the way. So that was my one, apart from food and beverage and things like that, which I've always liked. That was my one hobby that I would still love to keep going on, but it left me so long ago. It's really hard to get that enthusiasm back, even though I know I'd really like it. And I think I would be a better person for it. So I think that's great advice in the scope of what I would probably tell myself today.
So, Patrick, let me give you some advice as someone who's older than you. Have a very well balanced life. Don't put like I love what I do so much. I have to force myself to turn everything off at 5 p.m. And I've always said I'm so happy that I actually have a wife that I really like. I mean, we get along fantastically. We have so much fun together. If I didn't have that, I would keep working. The only reason I stopped working is because I like her more than work. But it's a close second. So again, my advice to you is develop a well-balanced life. All the things you used to enjoy, look, you may not enjoy them anymore. You may need to find some new things. But at some point, your work life it's not over, but it's come to fruition. And to be happy, especially for someone like me, I am very goal oriented. So for me, I have got to be achieving goals in order to be happy. That's a really exhausting way to live your life. And to find some happiness in something other than achieving a goal, I'm working on that right now. And it's tough for me at this point. So yeah, I think that's great advice.
I think so too. It's the old thing. If you're not moving forward, you're moving backwards. Well, that's all good and fine, but moving forwards can be a bit exhausting sometimes. I will say that too. So, like I said before, at age 40, I was in a very different place. Robb was very accomplished. I felt like I was very unaccomplished. And, 40 is just an arbitrary number, but I guess you have to have a guidepost somewhere. There's a lot of things I want to see and do before I'm 50, not because 50 means anything, but because you have to have an ultimatum somewhere because it motivates you to do things, and that's a good thing. So when I was 40, I was putting together the nuts and bolts of my channel because I saw 40 coming and I really wasn't progressing anywhere, still waiting tables. Trading was getting a little better, but we say it all the time. It's very inconsistent. And so I'm like, I need more than this. I don't, we say it all the time on the show here. I don't want to live off my trading, no matter how good it is. I need more. So that's when I really started to put everything together. So I was already kind of taking this advice, but again, I had nobody in my ear saying what I'm about to say right now. And my advice to myself, my 40-year-old self, would have been real simple. Go. Like, just crank it up, throttle up, and go. You have something really unique and really special to share with the world. For the longest time, you wanted to keep it to yourself. You made that decision to share it with people. Take the time you need to make sure it's a good product and it makes sense and it catches. But move forward. Go full throttle. Don't look back, because if this doesn't work, I'm not sure what the fallback would have been. So it's not that I would have been in a bad place. Like, again, I had a business that was doing decent, and I still had restaurants. Trading was better. But, I wouldn't have been able to live out the dreams I talked about before had I had not gone full throttle with this channel. And there were moments of doubt in between to where I just didn't think, I've said this on my own channel before, I thought maybe like 100, 200 people would be really interested in what I had to bring to the table. And what's that really worth? Can you even monetize something like that? It's good to have a group of people, but that's really all it is. And, maybe I'll get discovered by having a YouTube channel, but how big is that channel going to really even get? I didn't understand the scope of what I had to bring to this world, especially at the time. So there's a lot of moments of doubt there, and I could have really used somebody in my ear to say, hey, dude, it doesn't matter if this is going to work or not. Just go. Don't stop. now is the time to throttle up, because if not now, when?
I think that's great advice for really anyone who is not at the place where they want to be. I think that's, look, what do you have to lose? Go for it. Go for it. What do you have to lose? Everything. Guess what? People have lost everything before. And guess what? They were okay. It was tough for a while. But you know what? The people that worked their butts off, they got ahead. I think that's fantastic advice. And it really reminds me, I just went on a long road trip with my family, with my adult kids, which I'm so happy they still like to hang out. And we listened to the Matthew McConaughey book. I don't know what the name of the book is. You're going to have to look for it. And we listened to the audio book, which has him as the narrator. It's fantastic. And the very opening of the book talks about the flow of life and just to embrace the flow of life. There's periods of life where there's growth. There's periods of life where there's sadness. There's periods of life. And then there's these moments that are rushing, that are just so intense and rushing. And then there's these periods. And as someone who's older than probably most of the people listening to this, that's advice I want to give everyone here, is just cherish the flow of life. And if you're in a point like Patrick was at 40 and you're like, I'm going all in, I'm going all out, do it. Enjoy it. It's so great. Just embrace every little part of the moment of your life.
So on that note, I'm not sure what you took from this talk, if anything, but we hope you took something from it, or at the very minimum, you enjoyed it. Because Rob and I both wish you all a very happy holidays, whatever holidays those are, and we will stay right on schedule, and we will see you next week.
Happy holidays, everybody.